Anyway, for each class, I spent hours and hours preparing lecture notes, which in class I would either put on the overhead projector or I would write them on the blackboard behind me. And because the notes were different from the textbook, I decided to give my students a copy of my lecture notes. So as they walked out of the classroom at the end of the class, they could pick up a copy. Now, why do you think I handed them out at the end of class and not at the beginning? So you would listen to me, but isn't that already admitting that there's something wrong? Why force the students to get the information out of my mouth if they could get it out of my lecture notes? That never came up in my mind. But you know what happened? What happened was that at the end of the semester, about half a dozen students wrote on their evaluation questionnaire at the bottom, Professor Mazur is lecturing straight from his lecture notes. Hello? I mean, what was I supposed to do? There are another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the lecture notes I gave to them? These ungrateful students. But you know, they had a point. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. Anyway, given that all around the globe, from Malaysia to South Africa to Nigeria to the United States to the Netherlands where I grew up, to Australia, most classes take place in this mode, we could ask ourselves the question, is that what education is? Is education just the transfer of information? Let me take a little poll here. It's too bad we don't have a clicker, so but we'll do it again. If you think that education is just the transfer of information, 1. If you think information is more than the transfer of information, 2. Ready to vote? At the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead. 3? There's no 3. Okay, so people are raising their hands already. So go ahead. Raise it up. Wow, look at that. We're nearly unanimous. Raise your hand up, otherwise I'm going to come with the microphone. We're going to have to tell everybody. So 1 or 2? Okay. I see no 1s at all yet. Anybody have 1? It's too public, right? People don't want to admit that they're the only ones voting 1. Usually it's the same people who chose lectures in my previous question who have 1 or 2. But anyway, if anybody had 1 here, I have a warning for you. You are about to lose your job. Why? Well, imagine for a moment that education is just the transfer of information. What would be the logical thing to do? If education is just the transfer of information, what would be the logical thing to do? Think about it, pragmatically. Put it online, exactly. Videotape the best possible lecture, in different languages, of course, for chemistry, biology, and put it online. In fact, it is already happening. What would you lose by doing that? Besides our job, right? What would you lose by putting all lectures online?
Values.
Values? Or what else? Interaction. Oh, wait a minute. How much interaction is there in a real lecture? I am working really hard, and after all this lecture, I'm kind of getting hot here, but I'm working really hard on getting to interact with you. In most lectures, there's no interaction at all, which is in part because of this architecture. You sit down, you take on a passive role right away. I make a habit of dropping in on lectures on my own campus, in the business school, in psychology, in chemistry, in biology. And I see these brilliant lecturers lecturing, articulate, beautiful, polished. And then they stop and they say, does anybody have a question? Anybody? And you know, the students look down, they don't want to make eye contact. Right? And if they wait long enough that it gets painful, it's always the same person in the front row who reluctantly raises his or her hand. Most students do not want to interact. So I think you lose very, very little interaction. But you gain a lot because you actually provide an opportunity to think. In a lecture, there's very little time to think. Because if you start thinking, you cannot listen at the same time. As you daydream, the words that are coming into your ears can no longer be processed in a cognitively meaningful way. Have you ever had a student in one of your classes raise his or her hand and say, Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think. It's never happened in my classes. But online, it's easy. You just hit the pause button and you think. And when you're ready to listen again, you play. Same when you read a book. If you want to think, you say, let me think, I'm wondering about that. And then you continue reading after you've thought about it. So you actually will provide opportunities to think, something that is absent in a lecture. Or have you ever had a student raise her hand and say, Professor, could you please repeat the last 15 minutes? I need to hear it again. I've never had that, but online it will be really easy. So I think if education were just a transfer of information, not only are we all going to lose our jobs, but the obvious thing to do would be to put it online. I'm really happy to see that none of you, or maybe only a few of you, were thinking that way. So now let me turn to all those of you who had to know education is more than just a transfer of information, because I want to hear from you now what it is more. What is missing if it's more? I'm coming here so I can hear what you're saying. If it's more than just the transfer of information. Relationships, understanding, but understanding is again one of these fuzzy words, like education, right? Interpretation. Think about the little exercise that we did to start out with here. What was it? How did you learn the skill that you were so good at? Practicing. You need to do something. It's not enough just to take that information, put it in your skull, and move forward. As a learner, you need to do something meaningful with that information. You need to connect it to your existing experiences. You need to develop the mental models that allow you to apply whatever knowledge is embodied in that information in a new context. I think that's worth pausing for a moment. In a new context. You know, a year or two ago, I was giving a talk at the university south of Boston. Very well-known university, I won't name any names. And in the physics department. And after my talk, one of the physics professors came to me and he said, I had something really interesting happen to me this year. You see, he wanted to make physics relevant to his students. And in order to make it relevant, he put it in a real-world context. And the real-world context was baseball. There's a lot of physics in baseball, right? Trajectories of baseballs, collisions between balls and bats, and so on. So in class, he would use examples from baseball. On the homework, he would put baseball problems. On the midterm examinations, he would put baseball problems. At the end of the year, he was preparing the final exam, and he realized he had run out of baseball problems. So he put some football problems. Professor complained to students, "We have never done any football problems." But you're laughing. But I think we should really be crying about it. I'm sure you recognize some of your own students, or maybe some of your own discomfort when something was taken that you learned in one context into a new context. But after all, our students in the 21st century, whether they're scientists or doctors or politicians or lawyers, the problems that they will encounter in real life will not be textbook problems. In fact, whenever a student comes to me and tells me, "Professor Mazur, we've never done a problem like this before," I tell the student, "Look, if you had done a problem like this, it would, by definition, no longer be a problem.